a girl born in war, a voice from heaven, a mission that defied kings. Jeanne d'Arc was no princess. She was a peasant, a visionary, a warrior. In a world ruled by men and marked by betrayal, she rose with sword and faith to shape the fate of France. But glory has a price, and for Jeanne, it was fire. This is the story of the martyrdom of Joan of Arc. She was a peasant girl, raised among the hills of Domremy, a village on the border between hope and destruction. France was burning, torn apart by war, betrayal, and foreign powers. But in the heart of an insignificant valley, a girl was growing up who would change the course of history. Her name, Joan. No nobility, no education, barely able to write her own name. But she had something no general possessed: vision. At 13, while working in the garden near the village church, she was overcome by a light so bright it seemed to tear the sky open. In that light stood a figure, powerful, radiant, the Archangel Michael. Soon after, two female figures appeared, ones she recognized from church paintings, Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch, young martyrs who chose faith over life. Joan fell to her knees. She trembled with fear, but the voices spoke gently, firmly. God had chosen her, they said. Not a king, not a priest, a girl. Her mission was clear: drive the English from France, lead the army, and ensure the Dauphin, Charles, was crowned at Reims. The command was unbelievable, impossible, and yet she felt it in her bones. She was no dreamer, no child of madness. She had a purpose. For 3 years, she said nothing. She carried their words like a hidden flame in her heart, a fire that would grow into a storm. Because in a time when men listened only to swords, one girl heard something else. She heard a calling. By 1429, France was on the brink. The English, bolstered by their Burgundian allies, had pushed deep into French territory. Orléans, a critical gateway to the heart of France, was under siege. The Dauphin, Charles, clung to his claim, but few believed he would ever be crowned. And then came Jeanne. After months of rejection, she finally secured an audience at Chinon. A teenage peasant girl, dressed in borrowed clothes, claiming a divine mission. Yet when she stood before the Dauphin, she spoke with a conviction that silenced the room. She identified him in disguise, shared secrets no one could have told her, and declared God's will. Charles must be crowned, and she would lead him there. Astonished but desperate, Charles agreed. Jeanne was examined by theologians, interrogated by courtiers. She passed every test, declared devout, pure, and sincere. She was given armor, a sword, and a white banner. On it, the image of Christ, and the words, Jesus Maria. She rode at the head of the army, not as a soldier, but as a symbol. A girl who spoke of angels and marched into battle. At Orléans, the French morale had collapsed. But Jeanne's arrival changed everything. She moved through the troops like fire through dry grass, rallying them, praying with them, reminding them they fought not just for land, but for salvation. Within days, the English lines began to crumble. She led an assault on Les Tourelles, was struck by an arrow, but returned to the front the very next day. Her courage was contagious. By May, the siege was broken. The Maid of Orléans had delivered her first miracle. She had turned the tide of war. And for the first time in years, France dared to believe. The siege of Orléans had been lifted, but Jeanne's mission was not yet complete. The voices that guided her were clear. Charles must be crowned at Reims, the ancient seat of French kings. But the path was treacherous. Reims lay deep in enemy territory, surrounded by towns still loyal to the English or the Burgundians. Jeanne pressed the Dauphin to act. She had become more than a military mascot. She was now a moral force. Emboldened by her conviction and the string of unexpected victories, Charles agreed. The march to Reims became a procession. Town after town opened its gates, choosing to welcome the maid rather than resist her. Her reputation preceded her. To many, she was a prophet. To others, a divine sign that France had not been forsaken. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France. In Rheims Cathedral, amid incense and chants, the oil of sacred anointing touched his brow. Jean stood by his side, her banner raised higher than any sword. For her, it was the fulfillment of the divine mission entrusted to her by the saints. A farm girl from Domremy had brought a king to his crown, but not all were jubilant. Within Charles's court, murmurs of unease began to stir. Some nobles feared her influence, others resented it. The new king, cautious and politically inclined, began to distance himself. Jeanne felt it. The warmth began to fade, yet she refused to rest. France was still occupied. The English were not gone. Her voices still called. The coronation was a triumph, but it was not the end. Jeanne's mission was fulfilled in heaven's eyes, but her war on earth had only just begun. With Charles crowned, Jeanne's divine mission seemed complete, but in her eyes, the work was far from over. France was still fractured, and Paris, the heart of the kingdom, remained in enemy hands. Jeanne urged the king to strike swiftly, to ride the wave of momentum and reclaim the capital. But Charles hesitated. He had achieved legitimacy, and now he turned to diplomacy. Jeanne's fiery resolve clashed with the king's cautious court. Her divine conviction, once embraced as salvation, began to unsettle those who feared her growing fame. In September 1429, an assault on Paris was finally attempted. Jeanne, leading from the front as always, charged the gates. But this time, there was no miracle. She was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh and carried from the battlefield. The attack failed, and with it, so too began the decline of Jeanne's influence. Her military victories had once silenced doubters. Now, her setback gave them voice. Some courtiers whispered of arrogance. Others questioned her visions. The king, once inspired by her, now kept her at arm's length. Still, Jeanne would not retreat. She continued to lead minor campaigns, clinging to the purpose that had driven her from Domremy. But without royal backing, her forces thinned and her victories waned. She was no longer the sacred maid of Orléans. To some, she had become a nuisance, a holy girl out of time, out of favor, and increasingly alone. The fall had begun not with a betrayal, but with a silence. The silence of a king who turned away, the silence of a court that once cheered, and the silence of God, whose voices she could still hear, though fewer now, and more distant than ever. In May 1430, Jeanne's defiance led her to the fortified town of Compiègne. Still resolute, she was fighting on the front lines when the unthinkable happened. She was thrown from her horse and captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English. The girl who had once led armies was now a prisoner. Her captors knew her worth. Jeanne was no ordinary soldier. She was a symbol, a miracle to her followers, a menace to her enemies. For months, she languished in prison while negotiations unfolded behind closed doors. The Burgundians, always shrewd, saw an opportunity. And the English, who had long feared her as a witch, a heretic, a threat to their cause, paid for her transfer. She was delivered to Rouen, the heart of English-occupied Normandy. There, surrounded by enemies, she was locked away in a tower, guarded night and day. She wore chains. She was denied comfort, denied counsel. Her visions continued, but her hope began to waver. The greatest silence came not from heaven, but from the king she had crowned. Charles VII, whose throne she had risked her life to secure, made no effort to ransom her. No army marched in her name. No emissary came to plead her case. To the court at Bourges, Jeanne had served her purpose. Her flame, once so vital, now flickered in isolation. She was just 19. In the dungeons of Rouen, the girl who once defied kingdoms waited, not for rescue, not for justice, but for judgment. Her armor was gone, her banner stilled, only her faith remained, and that, too, would be put on trial. Jeanne was dragged before an ecclesiastical court in Rouen, an English stronghold cloaked in the robes of religion. Her charges were grave: heresy, witchcraft, and the unforgivable sin of wearing men's clothing. But beneath the surface, this was not a trial of faith. It was a political execution in disguise. She faced dozens of learned clerics, most of them hostile, all determined to break her spirit. But Jeanne, uneducated and alone, held her ground. She answered with clarity, wit, and unwavering conviction. When asked if she believed her voices came from God, she replied, "How else could I have done what I did?" Day after day, they tried to trap her, twisting her words, baiting her into confession. They scorned her visions, mocked her attire, and pushed her to recant. But Jean remained steadfast. She wore male clothing not out of vanity, but for protection. She obeyed the voices not out of madness, but out of faith. Still, the verdict had been written before the trial began. The court needed a heretic, and they would make one. On May 30th, 1431, at just 19 years old, Jean was led to the Vieux Marché in Rouen. Bound to a wooden stake, she looked out at the crowd, not with fear, but with serenity. Witnesses said she asked for a cross. A sympathetic soldier handed one to her. She clutched it as the flames rose. Her body was burned 3 times, her ashes thrown into the Seine. No shrine, no grave. They tried to erase her, but they could not silence her story. Because as the smoke faded, something else began. A legend. A girl who heard angels. A warrior who crowned a king. A martyr who would become a saint. Jeanne d'Arc was dead. But Joan of Arc had just begun. Jeanne's death was meant to end her story. Instead, it gave it immortality. For decades, she remained a controversial figure, remembered by some as a heretic, by others as a hero. But among the people of France, her memory burned brightly. Stories of her bravery, her visions, and her sacrifice spread from village to city. She became a symbol, not just of faith, but of resistance, of hope. In 1456, a second trial was ordered by King Charles VII, the same man she had helped crown, and who had done nothing to save her. This time the court declared her innocent. The charges were false. Her execution, a miscarriage of justice. Jeanne's name was cleared, but she was already beyond their reach. Centuries passed. Wars came and went. Monarchies fell. France changed. But Jeanne remained. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, the Catholic Church canonized her. The girl from Domremy was now Saint Joan of Arc. Today, her image stands in cathedrals and classrooms. Statues bear her sword. Writers, artists, and filmmakers retell her life. Politicians invoke her courage. She is claimed by feminists, nationalists, believers, and skeptics alike. But beyond the myths and symbols, there was once a real girl, barefoot in a field, hearing voices no one else could hear. A teenager who dared to lead armies, speak with kings, and challenge the world's most powerful institutions. She did not fight for glory. She did not fight for gain. She fought because she believed, and in doing so, she became more than a warrior. She became eternal. Joan of Arc was not a legend rising from the mists of the Middle Ages. She was a real girl, of flesh and blood. Born in a forgotten village, without power, without education, but with unshakable conviction. She dared to believe that one voice, even a female voice in a world of men, could make a difference. Her battle was greater than the wars she fought. She fought against systems that tried to diminish her, against a church that branded her a heretic, against a crown that forgot her. But above all, she fought for her vision, a France free from English rule, led by a rightful king, and blessed by God. That vision took her from the countryside to palaces, from the battlefield to the courtroom, and ultimately to the stake. Her life was short and tragic, but not meaningless. She was humiliated, burned, erased, yet never forgotten. Joan of Arc reminds us that true heroism requires no weapons, only willpower, no crowns, only faith, no permission, only the courage to rise when the world tells you to be silent. Her body turned to ash, but her story became eternal. Because as long as injustice exists, Joan will speak. Not as a myth, but as a girl who never stayed silent.